Larry Lala here with an exam tip in the area of torts, negligence, and specifically within negligence, some analysis of the standard of care and how to write it up. So just a quick reminder, the standard of care fits in here. Once you determine you've got a duty, you have to formulate a standard of care. And the question is, how do you find the standard of care in a fact pattern? The real answer here is that you don't find it. You really have to make a standard of care from the facts that are given. That begs the question, how do you do that? So we've got 3 tips on the standard of care. The first is to identify the specific action that caused the harm that's giving rise to the negligence claim. Then you can start to work on drafting a standard of care that is 1 or 2 levels more general or abstract than the action that caused the harm up here. Thirdly, you need to make sure that the standard of care that you come up with is drafted as an affirmative duty, not something that's negative, something that is what you're supposed to do, that describes what things should look like. Here's our example. We've got Jim, and he's got his little banana. And what's he going to do with the banana? He's going to eat it. And what's he going to do after he eats it? Like a jackass, he's going to drop the peel right on the ground. Some time passes, and we've got Bob. Bob is kind of looking this way as he's walking down the sidewalk. He doesn't see the banana peel. He steps on the banana peel and plop, he falls down. So we've got a nice lawsuit. We've got Bob as the plaintiff versus Jim as the defendant. He wants to sue for negligence. So what should the standard of care look like as drafted by Bob? First tip is to identify the specific action that caused the harm. Here, the specific action is Jim, the jackass, dropping the banana peel. Easy enough. The next tip is to draft a standard of care that is 1 or 2 levels more general or abstract than the action that caused the harm. This is a little trickier. So I want to try to show you what it looks like when you're too general and too specific. Let's start with too specific. What Bob could argue is that Jim should not drop banana peels. This doesn't quite work. It's too specific as a standard of care, and it's too simple. It's the way that I might yell at my kids, someone trips and falls, and it's like telling the kid not to trip and fall. That's not very useful guidance in terms of how they should behave. All it does is repeat the harm and tell them that they should avoid the harm. That's all that's happening here. This formulation of the standard of care just tells Jim that he shouldn't drop banana peels. The question is what he should do. So this is too specific. If that's too specific, then maybe Bob thinks to himself, aha, let's just impose this kind of general standard, this super general standard, be an angel at all times. Well, this is ridiculous. It's not specific enough as a guide to behavior. This is way too general. So if this is too specific, this is no banana peels, and this is too general, we are looking for something that's here. It's pretty close to specific. It doesn't pretend to be a super general guide to behavior. It's behavior that would guide the specific action that caused the harm. So what's the right formulation here? The next tip really helps with that. If you make sure that the standard is in the affirmative and not the negative, you're most of the way there. So here, Bob's formulation is, the standard of care is that a reasonable person would throw away refuse in a garbage can. This is the just right. This is making sure that the standard is in the affirmative and not the negative. So I want to give you a real student example of this. This is an actual exam that I looked at. I don't have the original fact pattern. Review this answer, look at the standard of care, even pause the video for a second and tell me what you think. Okay, this is a Big Bang Theory hypo, obviously. Sheldon has a duty of reasonable care to his roommate. Leonard is the plaintiff. Sheldon is the defendant. And the standard of care is apparently this. Reasonable people do not spread marbles all over the floor and fail to warn their roommates. How does this do in terms of the 3 tips that we set out? Definitely identified the harm that took place, but is this even 1 or 2 steps more general or abstract than the harm itself? No. It simply repeats the harm. Obviously, spreading marbles all over the floor and failing to warn roommates is exactly what happened. All this answer did was add reasonable people do not, and then do the harm. What we need is a standard of care. What a really effective exam answer will include a standard of care that goes 1 level more abstract than this. So this was my response. Read over it, take a second to read over it, pause the video if you want, and we'll talk about it. The guidance that I gave, that this student needed to identify an affirmative duty in his or her own words that people should follow instead of just saying they shouldn't do what they did. And again, I kind of repeated this example, like, it's not much guidance to your children if you just say, don't do what you just did. They need to understand what they should be doing. Here, the example is, instead of saying Sheldon had a duty not to leave marbles on the floor, we needed to go 1 level more abstract and say Sheldon had a duty to Leonard to leave the living room space they share as neat and safe as possible. Looking back, maybe this should be, we can go 1 step more specific and say, this is to suggest that maybe you can never play marbles on the floor, which would make the living room unusable. So maybe another way of formulating this is, if you play with marbles, clean them up after. Either of these formulations is 1 to 2 levels more specific than the actual harm itself, and would be recognized by most professors as a pretty good way of formulating the standard of care. That's it.